Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good break. I'm looking forward to learning Yeshayahu with you. And to make this somewhat interactive, if we can, I want you to feel free to use the raise your hand feature under the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try to prompt you during certain parts of the presentation for your questions or comments. You can also use the chat feature at any time, and time permitting, I'll try to get to as many of the posts as time permits. And finally, if you're comfortable doing so, I would encourage you to turn on your video so we could simulate an in-person class as much as possible under the circumstances. That way I could see you smiling, I could see you frowning. God forbid I could see you running out of the room screaming, but either way, at least I'll get a reaction, and know if I'm on track or off. And with that, I think I'm ready to start if everyone else is. So if we see our ancient prophets as wrestling with the same issues that we struggle with, we can begin to see the beauty and the relevance of their words. And that's an idea I want to come back to later at the end. I assume that everyone is here, not because of me, but because they love Yeshayahu and his Sefer. It is actually one of the most beloved books of our Tanakh. It accounts for more haftarot than any other prophetic book. We're now in a 7-week period called the Shiva de Nechemta, in which we read 7 straight haftarot from the second half of the book. Yeshayahu is actually, I saw someone say it's quoted in rabbinical literature more than any other prophetic book. And I'll just tell you anecdotally, I can say that it appears to be the most cited prophetic book at the YCT Yom Iyun, because I attended 3 classes this morning. Hillel Mali gave a shiur on Yeshayahu Perek Vav. Rabbi Beasley, who was doing Nahum, found a way to show intertextuality between that book and Yeshayahu. And Rabbi Littag quoted Yeshayahu's reference to God's brit with Noach from Yeshayahu Nun Dalet. And yet many people are not familiar with the book of Yeshayahu as a whole. It's a very difficult and even intimidating book. The Hebrew is hard. It actually contains more hapax legamenon, more words that do not appear anywhere else in Tanakh. It's mostly poetry. It's not a narrative, so it's hard to read as a story. This past spring, I had an opportunity to actually take a course in Yeshayahu, and I'm excited to share some of what I have learned. I'm going to share my screen. And as with most things, we start with Rashi. It was Rashi who first recognized that there are 2 separate halves to the book of Yeshayahu. On the first verse in Perek Mem, Rashi says, Nachamu, Nachamu, Choser al Nevuotav ha'atidot, lefi shemikan v'yat sof ha'sefer divrei nechamot. From here until the end of the book, says Rashi, Perek Mem till the end, is all words of comfort. Hifsik parasha zu beinam lebein hapuranut, and he used this chapter number 40, to break between the Nevuot of Puranut in chapters 1 through 39 and the Nevuot of Nechama that he found from chapter 40 and on. In 1775, a scholar named Doderlein suggested that the fact that there are 2 thematic halves of the book is evidence that there are 2 authors. And today, actually, the scholarly debate has shifted, not from whether there are 2 authors or not, but to whether the 2 halves of the book even belong together. Some think that the second half of the book was appended to the first half by accident. There may have been extra room on the scroll, or some clever scribe may have tried to save some money and actually append the second half of the book to the other side of the parchment. These are theories. So in the next 45 minutes to an hour or so, I'd like to explore 3 questions with you about Sefer Yeshayahu. 1, are there really 2 different halves of the book? 2, if so, can we nonetheless see the book as a literary unity? And finally, 3, what's at stake if we see the book as the work of one author or 2? So what is the evidence that there are 2 halves of the book? So I'm going to share my screen again and go to the first pasuk of the first parak of Yeshayahu. Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amos. Asher chaza al Yudah b'Yerushalayim b'mei Uziyahu Yotam Achaz Yechizkiyahu Malchei Yehuda. So according to this pasuk, Yeshayahu prophesied during the reign of 4 separate kings: Uziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, and Yechizkiyahu. And in this chart, which I have on the screen, which I also provided as a part of my source sheet, you can see that it covers about a 100-year period from as early as 788, when Uzziah is said to have been born, and about 687, which is when Chizkiyahu is thought to have expired. But the very earliest date in the book is actually found in my source 3. It's from Perek Vav, which we'll come back to later. There, Yeshayahu says, "B'shnat mot hamelech Uziyahu, va'are'et Adonai yoshev al kisei ram v'nisa." So it refers to the year of the death of Uzziah, which is around 740 or so BCE. And there are other dates to the Nevuot in the first half of the book, as you can see from sources 4 and 5. But actually, the last date that you'll find in the book is in chapter 36. That chapter begins a 4-chapter narrative from 36 till the end of 39, right before 40, and it's taken right out of Malachim Bet. Vahi ba'abas reishana lamelech Chizkiyahu Allah Sancheriv melech Ashur al kol arei Yehuda habetzurot vayit pesem. It describes an Assyrian attack on Judea and the siege of Jerusalem during the 14th year of Chizkiyahu's kingship. And it goes on to describe how Yeshayahu himself was instrumental in saving Jerusalem from that siege. So a little historical note: Assyria was the world's great power in the 8th and 7th century BCE. So that's the 700s and the 600s. And Assyria's siege of Jerusalem occurred in the year 701 BCE. So all of these dates, Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, Chizkiyahu, and the siege of Jerusalem, all place chapters 1 to 36 between 740 and 700 BCE, squarely in the late 8th century BCE. Now, the second half of the book, as Rashi put it, from verse 40 on, actually has no dates at all. But as we'll see, the prophecies are clearly addressed to a different audience and a different time period. I brought down Yeshayahu Mem Gimel. Ko amar Adonai go'alchem kadosh Yisrael. Thus says the Lord. L'manchem shilachti bavela. For your sake, I sent something to Bavel. V'oradati barichim kulam v'kastim ba'oniyot rinatam. And the Chaldeans, another word the Bible uses to describe the Babylonians, raised their voice in lamentation. So Babylon replaced Assyria as the world's great power in the late 7th century, culminating in 605 at the Battle of Carchemish. That's almost 100 years to the date after the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem that was described in the first half of the book. Babylon got around to attacking Yerushalayim shortly thereafter. As we unfortunately know, in 597, Babylon exiled the Charash and Masker, the artisans and the craftsmen, leaving behind only the poorest of the poor. And by 586 BCE, they destroyed Jerusalem, burned down the temple, and exiled the rest of the population. But Babylon's hegemony did not last very long after that. And that resulted in the lamentation that Yeshayahu Mem Gimel is referring to. So what happened to Babylon? If you look at source number 9, this is Perek Mem Hey of Yeshayahu. Ko amar Adonai leMashicho leKoresh. This is what God said to his anointed one, Koresh. Koresh was born around 580 BCE. I brought you a picture of a bigger-than-life monument to him in the form of a stone carving, which is on an ancient temple in modern-day Persia, also known to us as Iran. He was a Mede, or from Madai, who in 550 BCE usurped the throne of Persia. The Pasuk says that God grasped his right hand and allowed him to conquer nations and kings. Asher achazakti bimino l'rad lefanav goyim upatnei melachim achateach leftoach lefanav dlatayim u'sharayim lo yisageru. And indeed, in 539, as king of Persia, he conquered Babylon and issued an edict allowing the Judean exiles there to return to Palestine, at that time known as the Persian province of Yehud, and rebuild their temple. So this is over 150 years after the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem that is described at the end of the first half of the book of Yeshayahu. In Perek Mem Zayin, Redi ushvi alafar betulat bat Bavel, shvi la'aretz en kistei bat kastim. Sit in the dust, daughter of Babylon. Sit dethroned, daughter of Chaldea. This is another eulogy addressed to a defeated Babylon. And finally, Yeshayahu Memchet, Se'u mi Bavel barchu mi kastim. The Nabi says, leave Babylon, flee from Chaldea. This is addressed to the Judean exiles in Babylon who are now being summoned by the Navi to return to Israel. So I know I've thrown a lot of history or a lot of dates at you, but the bottom line is that from these and other Nevuot in the second half of the book, we see that a completely different world is being addressed. It's a 6th century BCE world in which Persia, not Assyria, not even Babylon, is the world's great superpower. It's a world where the prophet's audience is not Jews in Judea, but Jews in Babylon, and they are being asked to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So before we move on, are there any questions about what I suggest is evidence that there really are two thematically different halves of the book that address different audiences and at different time periods? Okay, I'm checking the chat, nothing there. I don't see any hands raised. I'm going to move on to what I said would be the second question, which is if we can agree that the two halves of the book do address different audiences at different time periods, can we nevertheless suggest that the book is nonetheless a literary unity? So what would establish a literary unity? How can one prove a relation between these two halves of the book? So we can look to common words or common styles. Those are kind of difficult since they're both written in Hebrew and stylistic differences are pretty subjective. You can look for common themes. You can look for common theological claims, common historical claims. What I want to do today is examine the unity of the book by exploring the relationship between two chapters of the book which are familiar to you and which each serve as introductions to their respective halves of the book. And that's Yeshayahu Perek Vav and Yeshayahu Perek Mem. Now, Perek Vav has been described as a call narrative, hence the title of my talk today. This morning, actually, Hillel Mali used the words Nevuat HaHakdasha Shel Yeshayahu to describe this perek. We have many call narratives in the Bible. We're all familiar with Moshe's call narrative. Yirmiyahu has one, and sometimes overlooked, actually. A very good example is Gideon's call narrative in Shoftim. I encourage you to take a look at that if you're so inclined. They all tend to fit a pattern. One is that there's the appearance of God. Two, there's a commissioning of the prophet by God. Three, there's an objection to the commissioning. And four, there's a divine response to the prophetic commissioning. So let's take Moshe Rabbeinu, for example. In a nutshell, God appears to Moshe at the Sneh. He gives Moshe a mission to take the Jews out of Egypt. Moshe objects as unworthy. And God responds by telling him not to fear, that he will be with him, and he will even encourage Aaron to help him. So here's Perek Vav on your screen. It starts off like all good narratives, call narratives, with the appearance of God. Pasuk Aleph, B'shnat Mod HaMelech Uziyahu, V'areh et Adonai Yoshev. This got transposed in word Al Kisei Ram V'Nisa, V'shulav Mlayim et Hayichal. In the year that King Uzziah died, the Yeshayahu says that he saw God himself. God was seated on an exalted high throne with the skirts of his robe alone filling the entire chamber that Yeshayahu was in. Srafim omdim mima'alo, says the Navi. Seraphs were attending him from above. What are Srafim? The word literally means burning ones. In Egyptian mythology, flying serpent-like fire-spitting monsters called Uraeus protected the gods with their wings. I have a rendition of an Egyptian Uraeus. It's there in number, right under in your source sheet, right under the Perek Vav. But how does Yeshayahu's seraphs, differ from the Egyptian Uraeus? Next pasuk. Sheish knafayim shteish kafayim le'achad, v'shtayim mechaseh fanav, u'v'shtayim mechaseh raglav, u'v'shtayim yofeif. Yeshayahu's seraphim have 6 wings, not 2. 2 are for flying, and we're going to see in a minute how important that was. But why are 2 covering their legs and 2 covering their face? So the legs have been seen as a euphemism for their private parts, which would need to be covered out of respect for God. But why would they need 2 wings to cover their faces? Not to protect God, who in Israelite culture would need protection, probably to protect themselves. As we'll soon see, it's very dangerous to be in the presence of God, even for monstrous seraphs. Pasuk Gimel. The kara ze el ze v'amar kadosh 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 Adonai tzvaot melo chol haaretz kvodo. Each seraph would kara, we'll see it's an important word, to the other about God's kedusha and kavod, another important word which fills the earth. And of course, this is the source of our kedusha prayer. Pasuk Dalet, vayanu amot hasipim mikol hakorei. The doorpost shook from the kol hakorei, from the sound of the one who called, the seraph, as smoke filled the chamber. So what is Yeshayahu describing here? We have a huge, bigger-than-life deity sitting on a high and exalted throne. The edges of his robe alone fill the entire chamber. There are fiery reptilian monsters shielding their faces, proclaiming his God's kedusha and kavod. There's smoke, presumably fire, since where there's smoke, there's fire. And the room itself is quaking. What emotions do you think this kind of a scene described by Yeshayahu would have evoked in its ancient Israelite audience? Well, Yeshayahu himself thinks he's going to die. Pasuk Hey, va'omar oy li ki nidmeti. Woe is me, for I am doomed. Ki ish tmei svatayim anochi, Uvatoch am tmei sfatayim anochi yoshev, yet the melech Adonai tzvaot ra'u einai. Yeshayahu thinks he's unworthy to behold God. Yet we'll see he is saved miraculously by one of the seraphim who fly at him and attack him with a burning coal. Pasuk Vav. Vaya'af elai echad min hasrafim u'v'yado ritzpah b'melkachayim lakach me'al ha'mizbeach vayaga al pi. He touched Yeshayahu's mouth with his burning coal. Vayomer hine naga zeh al sfatecha v'sar avonecha b'chatatcha tikupar. The seraph singes Yeshayahu's mouth with the coal. In the ancient world, actually, mouth-touching ceremonies were a prerequisite in order to stand in the presence of the Lord, or of the gods for them. Here, as we see in Yeshayahu, it's specifically for purification purposes. Yeshayahu has now been purified from avon and chatat. And this is all by the way of introduction. Now, in Pasuk Chet, we get to the commissioning. Vayashma'at kol Adonai omer et mi eshlach u'mi yelech lanu. Yeshayahu overhears God saying, "Who shall I send? Who will go lanu, for us?" From the word us, God appears to be in a heavenly council setting. Now, there are a number of heavenly court scenes in Tanakh, and I brought you some examples, starting with 12. Famously in Breshit, God says, "Vayomer Elohim, Naseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu." Let us create man in our image. In resolving to create mankind, God seems to be conferring with a divine entourage. In source 13 and Psalms, the psalmist reports, Mizmor la'asaf, Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, b'kerev Elohim yishpot. The psalm has God standing among a council of divine beings, adat el, who are sitting in judgment. And if you remember the end of the psalm, it's the Mizmor for Tuesday, you'll recall that God is greatly disappointed in these divine beings and demotes them from their divine status. We have a similar scene in Iyov, source 14. Vayhi hayom vayavo bnei Elohim l'jatsev al Adonai, vayavo gam hasatan b'tocham. God and some divine beings seem to be hanging around when the Satan drops by with his plot against Iyov. And finally, 15, in Malachim Bet, King Achab asks a prophet named Michaihu whether he should go to war. And Michaihu responds by describing a divine council setting, which is very similar to the one that Yeshayahu describes. Vayomer, Lachein shma dvar Adonai, ra'iti et Adonai yoshev al kiso, v'kol sva shamayim omer alav, mimino umismolo. So these council settings are ubiquitous, I would even say, in the Tanakh. Here we have one in Yeshayahu Vav. Let's go back to the first page. At the end of verse 8, Yeshayahu responds to God by volunteering. Va'omar hineni shlacheni, send me. And now the commissioning. Pasuk Tet, Vayomer, God says, Lech v'amarta la'am hazeh, tell that people, hardly a term of endearment, as we'll see. Shemu shamoav al tabinu, u'ru ra'ov al teida'u, hashmein leiv ha'am hazeh, v'aznav hachbeid, ve'inav hasha, pen yirev ve'inav, u'v'aznav yishma, u'levavo yavin, v'shav v'rafal lo. God's commissioning to Isaiah is to fatten the people's heart, stuff its ears, seal its eyes, lest they return and be healed. Yeshayahu's mission is to prevent the people from repenting. Much has been said about the theology of this. It was discussed at great length this morning in the first year. But at face value, God felt the people needed to be punished. And Yeshayahu, who was going to assist God in achieving that result. And it provokes an immediate prophetic objection. As we said, one of the prominent features of a call narrative. And it's in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Va'omar ad matai. Yeshayahu says, how long? Until when? And God replies, Ad asher im sha'u arim me'ein yoshev, uvatim me'ein adam, va'adama tishaesh mama, v'richak Adonai et ha'adam, v'rabah ha'azuva b'kerev ha'aretz. God says, until towns and houses are emptied and the ground itself lies desolate and the population is banished. What's more, va'od ba Assyria v'shava, and even if a tenth survives and returns, v'itala va'er, it too shall be ravaged. Ka'ila v'cha'alon, asher b'shalechet matzebepam, like a mighty oak of which only stumps are left after they are felled. The divine response to Yeshayahu's prophetic objection seems to be not reassurance, but unmitigated doom. Is there any hope in Yeshayahu Perek Vav? So let me just suggest the following. First, Yeshayahu in his objection said, Ad matai, how long? The question implies temporality, which God doesn't deny. He doesn't say forever. So there is an end, a light somewhere at the end of the tunnel. But the parak also ends with three words that I did not read. Zera Kodesh Matzavta. The leftover stump is a Zera Kodesh, a holy seed. This promises a surviving and purified remnant, but it is problematic. It seems to come out of nowhere, seems inconsistent with the rest of the divine response. And the three words are actually not found in the Targum HaShivim, the Septuagint, and they are widely considered to be a later scribal gloss. But I think even without those last three words, the stump imagery itself may have provided hope. I've brought you a verse from Iyov, which juxtaposes a tree stump with a human being. It's source 16. Yeah. Man, says Iyov, Yamut v'yachlash v'yigva v'ayo, languishes, dies, and is gone. But a tree, kiyesh la'etz tikva, a tree always has hope, says Iyov. Im yikaret v'ojachlif v'inaktolo tachtal, if it is cut down, it will renew itself, and its shoots will not cease. Im yaskin ba'aret shorsho uvafar yamut gizo, if its roots are old in the earth and its stump dies in the ground, mereach mayim yifrach, from the scent of water it will sprout, vasa katzir tmonata, and produce branches like a sapling. So to an ancient Israelite, hope may have been inherent in the stump metaphor itself, with or without the last three words of the parak. And finally, I argued this in a paper. Yeshayahu's experience in the first half of Perek Vav in the heavenly throne room provides hope. What happened to Yeshayahu? Through a painful and frightening process, he was saved from doom and emerged a purified prophetic messenger. This is to serve as a paradigm for Israel in the second half of the Perek. Yeshayahu's experience in the first part of the Perek foreshadows that Israel too will be undergoing a similarly painful and frightening near-death experience from which it too will emerge purified with a new and improved relationship with God. So before we proceed, I want to compare chapter Mem on this side of the page to Perek Vav. Does anyone have any questions or comments on what I am suggesting is the theme of judgment and implied hope in Yeshayahu Perek Vav?
Yeah, I see in the chat that Lauren Blatt asked, what exactly are the B'nai Elohim?
Taken at face value, these are divine beings. And this gets into a pretty nice discussion about monotheism and what being divine means takes us way past the scope of this year. But suffice it to say, I guess, that one theory of monotheism is not that God is the only divine being. We know we have Seraphim, we have angels, we might even have B'nai Elohim, but none of them hold a candle to God himself. So in one sense, God is not only he's qualitatively different from any other divine being. And that's what differentiates the Israelite God from other nations' gods back in the ancient Near East period. But that's a great question. Thank you very much for that. And I would love to address that at some later shiur, if invited. Anything else in the chat? I didn't check out to see if anything else. Thank you for that question. Okay. So let me just go to Perek Mem, because here I think is where we start cooking with oil. Okay, this is Perek Mem. So if you remember, this is what Rashi said was the beginning of the second half of the book. This is where the Nevuot turned from judgment to Nechama. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomar Elohechem. So who is being quoted in this Nevuah? It's Elohechem, your God. And he calls the Jewish people Ami, my people. A far cry from Yeshayahu Vav, where God called Israel Ha'am Hazeh twice, that people. And what's God saying? Nachamu, Nachamu. So for more years than I care to admit, I always thought that Nachamu, Nachamu Ami meant be comforted, my people. That God is addressing Israel to comfort it. But that would be Tinachamu, or actually that would be in the Nifal, right? Or Tinuchamu in the Pual, which is actually a word that appears in Yeshayahu in Perek Samach Vav. The verb Nachamu is like Dabru and Kiru in the second verse. It's a second person plural imperative. In the PL stem, for those who are keeping score, it's a command. Nachamu. God is commanding someone in the plural to comfort Israel. Nachamu Ami. But who? Let's go back to Rashi on this pasuk. Source 7, the last words. Nachamu atem niviai nachamu et ami. You, my prophets, comfort my people. God is calling on his prophets to comfort people. It's a call narrative. According to Rashi, God is calling out to a group of prophets in a court-like, council-like setting, not unlike the divine council-like setting in Yeshayahu Vav. And God's message that he wants them to convey is in verse Bet. Dabru alei v'Yerushalayim v'kiru eleh ki nirtza avona ki lacham yad Adonai ki malat tzva'a ki nirtza avona ki lacham yad Adonai kiflayim b'chol chatoteha. Dabru alei is a very rare phrase in Tanakh. I brought down actually on your source sheet the various times that it appears. It appears in Ruth and Boaz. It appears between, interestingly, Dinah and Shechem. And it appears in Genesis in the Joseph story, which I think makes the point very beautifully. The Torah is describing Joseph's rock-approach mountain with his brothers as an act of true and abiding, almost romantic love. And here in chapter 40, God is asking his prophets to reach out to the Jewish people with this kind of love conveyed on his behalf. Back to verse 2. God says, Kiru to Yerushalayim. Remember, Kiru is the word that was used in Perek Vav to describe the Seraphim's Kedusha proclamation, the Kara Ze El Zeh. Here, God is asking the Nevi'im to Kiru to Israel, that her term of service is over, that her avon is forgiven, and her chataot are gone.
I'm sorry, are you able to move please move this window away from the screen box so everyone can see that? Yeah, that one.
Yeah, can I move that?
If you're able to.
No.
Okay, never mind.
What is that?
It's a good question.
Okay, thank you. It's going away a little bit. Okay, I apologize for any inconvenience for you guys. Okay, so here we see that as opposed to Yeshayahu Vav, where it was Yeshayahu's Avon and Chatat that were purified, here it is all of Israel whose Avon and Chatat are forgiven. Parsha Gimel, Kol Koreh, again, like the Srafim in chapter Vav. The voice cries out, Bamidbar panu derech Adonai, Yashru barava misila le'Eloheinu. Clear a path for the Lord. And you may remember this last part from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Let every valley be raised, every hill made low, rugged land become level, and all the mountain ridges a plain. V'nigla kvod Adonai, v'ra'u kol basar yachtav ki pi Adonai diber. All flesh will now see the kavod of God. Here too, like in Yeshayahu Vav, there's a reference to God's kavod, but instead of the Srafim proclaiming it, here the Navi says, all flesh will see it. Verse 6, Kol Omer Kra, again a voice. And this voice asks someone to call out, Kra. A prophet has been chosen and given a mission to call out. And right on cue, we have the prophetic objection. Va'amar, ma'ekra, just like in Perek Vav, ad matai. Kol basar chatzir v'chol chasto ketitza sadeh. All flesh is grass, all is goodness like the flowers of the field. Yavesh chatzir navel tzitz, ki ruach Adonai nashva bo. Grass withers, flowers fade when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Achein chatzir ha'am. In case you missed it, in this metaphor, the Nabi is saying the grass represents the people, Israel, which is as evanescent as grass. But what is the Ruach Elohim, Ruach Hashem, that has withered them? It's God's judgment, which resulted in their exile. The prophet is saying, my mission is doomed. These people, having been exiled, have withered and died. To which God responds, Yavesh chatzir navel tzitz, udvar Eloheinu, yakum leolam. Grass may wither and flowers fade, but you can trust the word of the Lord to be forever fulfilled. So I want to come back to that last divine response to the prophetic objection. But first, I want to just note the connections between Yeshayahu Vav and Yeshayahu Mem. And I have a little chart here, which I hope everyone can see. Yeshayahu Vav and Yeshayahu Mem both have God in a divine council. Both have voices calling out, kol koreis. Both have God's kavod featured. But whereas in Perek Vav, it was the Srafim that proclaimed it, in Yeshayahu Mem, God promises that all will see it. In Yeshayahu Vav, God is purified from Chet and Avon. I mean, Yeshayahu is, whereas in Yeshayahu Mem, it is all of Israel whose Chet and Avon are forgiven. In Yeshayahu Vav, Israel is called Ha'am Hazeh. Here, they're called Ami, and God is called Elohechem. In Perek Vav, Israel is a prophetic objection, as in Perek Mem. There's a divine response to the prophetic objection, as in Perek Mem. But whereas in Perek Vav, the message is judgment with what I considered or suggested was implied hope. In Perek Mem, the message is all comfort and even love. So Yeshayahu Mem appears to be not only alluding to Yeshayahu Vav, but reworking the Nevuah, reversing its message of judgment, extending and building on what I called its implied message of hope. The relationship between Yeshayahu Mem and Yeshayahu Vav establishes that the two parts of the book, or at least the introductory call narratives of each, were meant to be read together. So before I get on to that last verse in Yeshayahu Mem, are there any questions or comments about the relationship between Yeshayahu Vav and Yeshayahu Mem? As I suggested. Oh, David. Okay, Ms. David. I can do this.
Hi. So my question is, my understanding is that even those who want to maintain that these are two separate works within Yeshaya, they still understand that the later part is aware of the earlier part and playing off of it. So how does showing these literary connections show unity of the work?
Yeah. Well, not everyone believes that there's a unity of the work. I'm suggesting that there's a unity to the work. If there is no unity, it's hard to say that it's one author. That it's one author. I'm suggesting there is a unity, and at the end, I'm going to address what's the practical difference if we say it is one or is two. Okay, so I'm going to get to your point in just a minute. Okay, but let me just finish with that. How do I get out of this chat? Okay. Okay, now, so I want to just go back to that last line of verse 40. Dvar Eloheinu yakum lo'olam, and then wrap up. So in the context of Perek Mem, Dvar Eloheinu yakum lo'olam is God's word of comfort. But this message of comfort can raise a question with its Israelite audience. The audience might well ask, why should we trust in a word of God who rejected us, destroyed our temple, and exiled us in the first place? I believe that the second half of the book actually addresses this very question. And if I go to source 22, it's the Rishonot. Perek Membet, Harishonot, Hine Vau, V'achadashot ani magid, v'terem kitzamachna shmiatchem. The Rishonot, said God, the things I once predicted have come to pass. Now I speak chadashot, new words. The argument is, you can trust my current promises of comfort because my earlier predictions were fulfilled. But what earlier predictions, what earlier Rishonot is Yeshayahu talking about in Perek Membet? So look at source number 24. Magid mereshit acharit, umikerem asher lo nasu, omer atzati takum v'chol chapsi eseh. From the beginning, I told of events before they occurred. I fulfilled my plan and did what I said. What was the plan that God's referring to here? Korei mi mizrach ayit. I summoned an ayit from a faraway place in the east. Mi eretz merchak ich atzati. Who is the eagle from the east that God says he called? That's Koresh from Persia, which is east of Assyria. Af dibarti, af aviena, yatsarti, af esena. I spoke and I brought him. It was my design, God says. I did it. And in source 25, hikavzu kulchem ushma'u, mivachem higidet eile. Gather round, whoever told you this? Adonai ahivo yaseh chetzo bevavel uzro kastim. God's beloved will work his will against Babylon and Chaldea. Who was God's beloved who went on to defeat Bavel? Again, this is Koresh. God says, Ani dibarti af prativ. Hivioti v'tzliach darko. I brought him. I said I would bring him. I brought him, and I ensured that his mission would be a success. So the Navi is saying that the Rishonot, God's predictions of Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, came to pass. This, the Navi argues, is proof that the current prophecies of comfort from Perek Mem on can be trusted. Dvar Eloheinu yakum le'olam. But where were these Rishonot recorded that the Navi is referring to? Where and when did God make these predictions about Koresh? In the first half of the book of Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu Yud Gimel. Masa Bavel Asher Chazah Yeshayahu ben Amos. This is Yeshayahu's oracle against Bavel. Hineni me'ir alehem et Madai. God says, I will rise Madai against them. That's Koresh, the Mede, who rose up against Babylon. Vaita Bavel tzvi mamlachot teferet ka'um kastim kemapechat Elohim et Sdom bet Amorah. Babylon will be overturned like Sdom and Amorah. It is this prediction of Persia defeating Babylon from the first half of the book that is the Rishonot of the second half of the book. And it is this Dvar Eloheinu that the Navi is alluding to in Perek Mem, when he says, Dvar Eloheinu yakum le'olam. And in fact, what do we say every morning in davening? Right after Shema, we say Al Harishonim, Al Ha'achronim, Davar Tov V'Kayam Le'olam Va'ed. This is the siddur riffing on Yeshayahu Mem. The Rishonim are the Dvar Eloheinu Sheyakum Le'olam. The siddur is connecting the Rishonot of the latter half of Yeshayahu to the verse in Perek Mem, Udvar Eloheinu Yakum Le'olam. So if I have succeeded, I have shown that there are two halves of the book and that the two halves are a literary unity. People seem to agree with that. So third, I said that I would consider what's at stake if we see the book as the product of one author or two. So if there is one author, Yeshayahu ben Amos, from the 8th century, it would mean that God gave prophecies to an 8th century prophet, which were addressed to Babylonian exiles living 200 years later in the 6th century BCE. Now, to those of us who believe in Nevuah, it's certainly plausible. But one could ask, why would God do such a thing? Did God not trust any 6th century prophet to deliver this message? We know there were prophets during the 6th century, during Shivat Zion, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and probably other prophets whose prophecies were not preserved. And also, this would be the only example in Tanakh of a nevuah that was given in one generation for use and to address people hundreds of years in the future. But what if we consider that the 6th century prophet, that a 6th century prophet, delivered the prophecies in the second half of the book?
I hate to interrupt, but I just want to give a 10-minute warning if you want to leave some time for questions.
I think we're doing it. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So what if we consider that it was a 6th century prophet who delivered the prophecies in the second half of the book? That would mean that a later prophet who wished to remain anonymous appended his prophecies to an earlier prophetic work and intentionally tied his prophecies to the prophetic works of Yeshayahu ben Amos, reaching back to the past for authority for his new nevuah. This would give us a message relevant to our times. We all know that for religion to be relevant, we need new messengers and new messages for new circumstances and new times. But those messages must be rooted in the past. If the second half of the book of Yeshayahu is indeed the words of a different and later prophet, that prophet is stressing that his message of comfort and love is connected to, an extension of, and should be read together with the earlier words of God as conveyed through Israel's earlier prophets. So as we in the 21st century engage and negotiate with modernity, the need for new messages rooted in the old is as relevant today as it was in the 6th century BCE. As I said in the beginning, it is when we recognize that our struggles are the same struggles that concerned our ancient prophets, then we can start to appreciate the beauty, the timelessness, and the relevance of their words, which can serve as instructions and inspirations for us today. So I'd be more than happy to open up the discussion. That's the end of my presentation. Take any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, chat posts, anything you like, but please feel free to comment and let me know. I know what I think. I'd like to know what you think. Let me stop sharing. Okay, I guess I can ask David, did I address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, we have a few more minutes, but there's no reason to hold people unnecessarily. So I'll just give a few more seconds. I'll check the chat. Okay. So thank you all for your attention. I hope we learned something about Yeshayahu. As I said, it's a very popular book. It's a book that I think is not very well studied. It does take a lot to study the book, but I think anyone that starts doing that will be amply rewarded.